Let's talk turbos. More importantly, the 300ZX turbos, because there are more than a dozen different models that you can pick from on the market right now, ranging anywhere from a 400 horsepower setup all the way up to, I would say, 1300 horsepower. Now, a couple days ago, I asked you guys on social media what you were most interested in for a turbo setup on your own builds. And so I compiled a list of turbos that are the most common and or people have shown the most interest in for their own future setups. And hopefully by the end of this video, you will be able to take any turbocharger from any manufacturer and break it down to the compressor size and turbine wheel size, as well as the housing sizes of the turbos, and make your own educated guesses based on what you will learn from this video to determine which turbos you actually need for your setup. Now, if you look behind me, I have 3 turbos. I have one from my friends over at Boost Lab. This is the BL54XR, which will soon be going on to that little blue baroo right there. And then I also have the PSR 5449, AKA the G25 660s from Pulsar. Now, Pulsar changed their name on the 5449 from the G25 660, I would imagine because of something going on with Garrett. But what's unique between these turbos, I will say, is that they are roughly the exact same sizing. Obviously, there are some quality differences, which I can break down for you guys in this video, but we're going to skip over these and save these till the very end. I'm going to start with the most common setups first. Some of the more common turbo setups that you can get for the 300ZX being the GT2860 Disco Potato, the JWT Sport 700, or for instance, the newer GTX 2867 Gen 2 turbos. Now, I would say these are some of the top of the most common turbos that you can get for your 300ZX, whether it be a stock motor or fully built motor, and you can make ample amounts of power with any of those turbos. And I will say that 600 to 700 horsepower mark is kind of a sweet spot, because to go beyond that even 800 horsepower mark, it takes a lot. Ask me how I know. So the big question everyone has realistically is which turbo will be best for my build at 600 to 700 horsepower, or which turbo has the quickest response? Well, obviously there's going to be a little bit of a give and take with that. And the reason is because, well, bigger turbos take longer to spool. At the very bare minimum, when you have a larger frame turbo, you're spinning a bigger wheel. That's physics. However, there are multiple different ways to get those big turbos to spool up quicker, which that is not the point of this video. We're going to stick with the bare frame technology of the turbos. So for starters, the different manufacturers have different, what I'm going to call nomenclature for the names of their turbos. For instance, the Garrett uses a GT2860. The GT28 being the frame size and the 60 being the exducer of the compressor wheel. Okay, before I go any further with this, let's break down the general terminology of a turbocharger. Now, if you aren't familiar, air goes in here, comes out of here. This is the cold side. Then you have the hot side. This is all exhaust. Exhaust comes in here, comes out on this side. However, if you are not familiar with the turbine wheel and compressor wheels, obviously the compressor wheel is on the cold side, turbine wheels on the hot side, and they are geared together with a shaft that runs all the way through. So this here is commonly known as the inducer of the compressor housing. Then you have the exducer. So as air comes in here, this wheel actually forms out and fills out this outer ring. So there's a small side of this compressor wheel, then there's a bigger part of it. However, when you switch over to the turbine side, you have the exducer, which is a smaller portion of the turbine, and you have the inducer of the turbine portion, which is the larger side. So they're pretty much opposites of each other as far as the real naming of the turbine sizes. Now, that is ultimately what I like to go based off of, because once you get into drag racing and stuff like that, certain class limitations will revolve entirely around this guy right here, which is the inducer of the compressor wheel. And that is really what companies like Precision, for instance, like to go off of. They will call a 6466 as the 64 millimeter portion here, and then the 66 millimeter portion will be here. Also, I'm going to mention one more thing here that I probably should have mentioned earlier, and that is going to be the AR size. Now, the AR size can be moved from standard, I would say, is a 0.64 for a lot of these turbos, up to a 0.86 on your standard GT28 series turbo. Now, I have to read off the definition because I can never seem to remember it. And it is primarily defined as the inlet cross-sectional area divided by the radius from the turbo centerline to the centroid of that area. Yeah, that doesn't really mean too much. It could be very confusing. Let me try to simplify this for you as best as I can. Basically, the AR is determined by this radius here along with the area of this here. Pretty much what you need to know is bigger AR equals slower spooling turbo. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the wheel sizes have changed. It's just the housing itself. Basically, there's more volume to fill on a bigger AR turbo than a smaller AR turbo. And you're probably wondering, why would I want a bigger AR turbo on a smaller housing turbo? So my recommendation is this. If you're getting a smaller turbo, but you want to stay in 22 plus PSI of boost regularly, go ahead and get a bigger AR housing because it'll drop your EGTs, your temperatures, and it'll improve the flow of the turbo at those higher PSI levels. Different companies will use different terminology for their turbos based on whatever they feel like. At some point, Garrett switched over to using G25 instead of GT28. And because of that, they have added on to it, instead of a secondary wheel size, they have changed the second part of that name to equate to the amount of horsepower the turbo will produce. For instance, the G25 660 is technically still a 54 millimeter inducer. However, because the turbo is rated at 660 horsepower, they basically tell you it is a G25 frame turbo rated at 660 horsepower. What's funny is this here is also a 54 millimeter turbo that can make 660 horsepower. So they're very, very relative in a lot of sizing. However, the technology and quality control that goes into each turbo might be a little bit different. So I would say for decades, the 300ZX go-to aftermarket turbo has been the disco potato because of its compact design and power that it can make. Now, people have made easily 600-700 horsepower out of the old school GT2860 turbos. However, even with the newer ones, people are making 700 plus horsepower on E85. I think I've even seen as high as 800 horsepower. Now, over the years, turbo technology has greatly improved. We went from probably the early 2000s, where everything was a cast wheel, journal bearing design with 270-degree thrust washers, to nowadays we have dual ball bearing, billet compressor wheels with 360-degree thrust bearings as basically standard across the industry. Not to mention the turbo blade design has improved so greatly over the last 10 years. It's literally doubled the amount of power that a turbo of similar size can make. For instance, a GT2860R, the original disco potato from the early 2000s, was one of the first ball bearing turbos on the market, and it was capable of about 350 horsepower. Nowadays, a turbo of similar size, being the G25 660, can now make 650 horsepower. Now, when picking a turbocharger for your Z, there are two big things that you really need to take into consideration, and that being primarily your end goal for horsepower and how quickly you want them to spool up. Be very careful about how small of a turbo you get, because once you cross that 600, 550 horsepower mark, if the turbo spools up too quick and makes too much torque down low, you will have plenty of engine problems to keep you busy. Because realistically, these small displacement V6, even 4-cylinder motors, and this goes for any platform, I don't care what it is, typically higher load in lower RPM range puts a lot more stress on a motor than higher load, higher RPM range. Because if you think about it, a motor under 20 pounds of boost at 2800 RPM has a lot more time to hold that piston up under that boost level than it does at 7,000 RPM. If you guys look back and see all of these Supras making 1,000 horsepower on a stock motor, well, the real key to that is that they have a big enough turbo that generates enough lag to where the car literally makes no power, probably less than 300 horsepower, below 5,200 RPM. Anything above 5,200 RPM is pretty much free game for those cars. Also, one more reason why you should consider building your heads and throwing in a big set of cams, because bigger cams and higher flowing heads will ultimately help your turbos spool up sooner. It will shift the power band up higher in the RPM range. However, getting that turbo to spool up another 1 to 200 RPM sooner will help you out greatly. So I have in my phone right now several turbos pulled up, being what I have just said. And I'm gonna go over the compressor sizes of each, as well as the horsepower rating of each turbo. Now, to add to this, each turbo has what's called a flow rate, and this is typically in pounds per minute. Now, this can go for fueling as well as airflow, and typically 1 pound per minute is equivalent to 1 horsepower. So a 500 pound per minute turbo would make 500 horsepower. Typical rule of thumb. Okay, so for starters, let's start with the old school cast wheel disco potato. This one is the GT2860. Now I have here, it says the compressor wheel is a 47 millimeter, and the exducer of the turbine side, the exhaust side, is also a 47. So, as precision would call it, this would therefore be a 47-47. And this turbo is rated at a maximum of 350 horsepower, just one of them. So if we have 2 of them on a 300ZX, you're looking at about a 700 horsepower capable setup. And also, like I just said, the exducer being a 60 millimeter on the compressor side. Now, moving into today's standard of turbos, we now have the GTX series. There is a Gen 1 and the Gen 2, minor differences between the two. However, the Gen 2 obviously does make more power. The X in GTX stands for billet compressor wheel. Obviously, the 60 still standing for the exducer of the compressor wheel. However, they have modified the inducer of the compressor on the GTX 2860. The inducer of the GTX 2860 is now a 46 millimeter turbo. That's right, it dropped in size, but you know what? This turbo now makes an additional 100 horsepower more. That's right, this turbo dropped an extra millimeter. However, it now makes an extra 125 horsepower as compared to its old school design, meaning that this turbo is now technically a 46-47 that is now capable of 475 horsepower. Put 2 of them together and you now have a turbo setup that is capable of pretty much 900 horsepower. This is one of those rod bending turbos where if you're not careful, it'll completely decimate your entire motor because of the amount of torque it'll make in the lower RPM range. So if you're looking for a bolt-on upgrade that's readily available on the market, the GTX 2860 Gen 2 has honestly been tried and true, and it's pretty much a cut and dry package. Okay, so moving on from the GTX 2860, there's also the GTX 2863, which you could pretty much figure out at this point, hopefully, the difference between the GTX 2863 and the GTX 2860. Mainly the exducer on the compressor wheel. However, we then move up to the GTX 2867, and here's where things kind of change a little bit. You see, on the GTX 2867, it is still a GTX 28 frame turbo. However, the 67 means that the exducer is now a 67 millimeter, and they also bumped up the inducer of the compressor. So the intake of the GTX 2867, this guy right here, is now a 50 millimeter instead of a 46. What you could probably imagine is that they pretty much machine out this housing to fit a larger diameter intake wheel. Pretty cool stuff, right? And with the GTX 2867, you now have a turbo that is capable of flowing 550 horsepower. Now, if you really want to get detailed on this, you could look up the compressor maps of each and every turbo on the Garrett website. Now, compressor maps can be very complicated to read in that, well, it's basically just giant circles and lines on a graph. Essentially, what you want to look at is the pounds per minute at the bottom and the pressure ratio on the left side of the map. Because let's say you want to try to shoot for 600 horsepower at 20 psi of boost. You would essentially have to look at the pressure ratio on the left side of the map, which 20 pounds of boost is essentially 1.5 bar. However, this is based off of absolute pressure. Now what that means is 1 bar is equal to 0 vacuum and 0 boost in the car. So basically you want to be looking at 2.5 on the pressure ratio and roughly 30 pounds per minute on the flow rate. Now the reason I say 30 pounds per minute is because we are using 2 turbos, So 230 pound per minute would equate to roughly 600 horsepower. You following me? Okay, so moving on from the GT28 frame size, we now have the GT30, the GTX30. I'm not even gonna go back to the GT. These turbos barely fit in the 300ZX. The next size up would be the GTX35, and you pretty much should expect to either beat in your frame rails or box them in, which is something that the GTRs do. I'll let you guys look that up. Now, the GTX 30 series turbos is, well, you could just expect quite a bit of lag here. And in all honesty, if you go to a GT30 frame turbo, get the smallest AR possible, because if you get an 86 AR GT30 frame turbo, you basically can expect that thing to never spool in first or second gear. But for the hell of it here, I'm gonna throw in this turbo and say that one GTX 3071 turbo is capable of 675 horsepower. And being a GTX 3071, obviously the X-Deucer being 71 millimeters, the inducer of that is now a 54 millimeter inducer. So the inducer is pretty much the same size as the GT2867. However, obviously the X-Deucer is a little bit larger, being 71 millimeters. Now I will say I did have the GT2871 turbos. These were the old school ones with cast wheels on my old setup. And these had a 86 AR exhaust housing, and they were just too laggy for me and my liking. They picked up quite a bit on E85. It helped the turbo spool a little bit quicker, but overall in general, I would not suggest anything larger than a 2871 86 AR on any 300ZX, just because it's too much. Unless you're actually going to build the car to stay in the boost with like an automatic turbo 400, and it's gonna be in boost all the time, try to kind of stay away from those 86 AR turbine housings especially. Let's jump into the turbos such as the G5 from CZP and the VGX 800 from Z1 Motorsports, because these are two companies that specialize in Z parts, Z32 specifically. The beautiful thing about the G5 turbos is they actually start the center housing as a GT2554 base. And you could pretty much look at a GT2554 series turbo as pretty much a stock turbo upgrade. It looks about the same size as a base turbo that comes in a 300ZX. It is a 42 millimeter inducer with a 42 millimeter X-Deucer. So it's extremely small. However, with the G5 turbos, they took it and made the compressor wheel a little bit larger and out of billet. Now I will say, based on the size of these turbos, they will make a lot more torque than horsepower. But just to put it into perspective, if you make probably 520 horsepower out of these turbos, you could probably be looking somewhere in the neighborhood of 550 to 600 foot-pounds of torque at 520 horsepower with the 85, which is freaking phenomenal, and that is going to be one hell of a street car. One more thing to add about the GT2554 turbo, and to compare it to the factory size of the OEM turbo, the turbo from the factory is a 40 millimeter inducer with a 38.9 millimeter X-Deucer. So pretty much makes it a 40-39. That is extremely small. Okay, so moving off of the G5 turbos, we are moving into the VGX 800 turbos offered by Z1 Motorsports. Now, the VGX 800 series turbos in general are described as having the flow characteristics of a 2867 while having the similar spool characteristics of a 2860. Knowing what we've already learned, all the GTX 28 series turbine housings are pretty much the same depending on their AR. They all have the same 54 millimeter X-Deucer, and I believe it's a 57 millimeter inducer on the turbine wheel. The biggest difference with the GTX 2863 is it's probably got a 63 millimeter X-Deucer on the compressor side. So it's probably a 54 inducer with a 63 millimeter X-Deucer, bumping the flow rate of this turbo up to about 375 to 400 pounds per minute, making two of them roughly 800 horsepower capable, possibly 9. Basically, if you're looking to make anywhere north of 700 horsepower when you're really looking to have fun, and you're trying to keep it fun and happy at right around 500 to 600 horsepower and run pump gas, honestly, the VGX 800 turbos is not a bad way to go. And then, of course, after all this is said and done, you also have the JWT series lineup of turbos, which is essentially the same thing that most other manufacturers have done, where they all started with a Garrett base as a core, and then they've upgraded little things here and there. So the JWT 700, from what I've found, is a 60 millimeter compressor at 700 horsepower. That pretty much means that 60 millimeter is the exducer side of the compressor. So it is essentially a GT 2860 turbo reworked for the 300ZX and capable of 700 horsepower, which, if you ask me, a GTX Gen 2 is plenty capable of 700 horsepower on E85. So JWT 700, GTX 2860, pretty much the same thing. Okay, so finally moving on from that old school GTX GT style of turbo, we are now moving into the G25 and G30 series of turbos. Now, if you look at the ones here in front of me, they do not have provisions for the internal wastegates. All of these turbos are externally wastegates, which means you have to buy wastegates on top of it. So it's one more thing to consider. However, I will say the Pulsar rendition of the G25 660 is substantially cheaper than just about anything else you can find, especially if you go through a dealer of somebody you know, such as Maslow Motorsports. Also, you can buy this same style turbo from my buddies over at Boost Lab, which you can get in a V-band style turbo as well. This one, however, is going on to my BRZ in the very, very near future. But as you can probably imagine, the G25 nomenclature is the overall frame sizing of the turbo. So you have the G25, the G30, the G35, and the G40, G42 size turbos. So the G25 series turbos is the most similar thing to a GT28 size. And I would say without the external wastegates, these are quite a little bit more compact than a GTX 28 style turbo is. Some of the coolest features about these turbos is that they are not only dual ball bearing and billet compressor wheel with a 9-blade design, but they're also capable of 660 horsepower out of a disco potato sized turbo. Now, if you remember in the beginning of this video when we were talking about the GTX 2860 turbo, that was a 47 millimeter inducer with a 49 exducer. Well, that turbo is only capable of 350 horsepower. The G25 550 turbo, which is one size smaller than the 660, the G25 550 is a 48 millimeter compressor wheel with a 49 millimeter exducer that is capable of 550 horsepower, that's wild, that's awesome. So essentially you have a disco potato sized turbo that is capable of making 1,000 to 1,100 horsepower. That is freaking crazy. And if you go one step bigger, I would say these are about equivalent to a 2867, and these two combined are, well, they're 660 horsepower each. So do the math. That's about 1,320 horsepower combined of airflow. So realistically, I would say it's about a 1,200 horsepower capable setup. That is awesome for turbos in this size, and they fit very, very comfortably in the 300ZX engine bay. I have had zero problems so far with my Pulsar turbos. If you look really closely with the Polar Engineering manifolds, you have to get a reverse rotation setup. So if you look at this one, this turbo spins this way and this one spins this way. Now that pretty much ties it up for my entire Garrett line of turbos, as well as the, oh wait, we have not gotten into the precision turbos yet because there are single turbo kits now available through Merlin Machining. As far as precision single turbos go, I use precision as kind of a standard sizing. I like their nomenclature the best. They pretty much give you the inlet and outlet of the turbo in the naming. So a precision 6466 would be awesome turbo for about, I would say, anywhere between 700 to 900 horsepower capable setup. However, let's say you have a stock motor 300ZX and you're buying the Merlin Machining kit. My personal suggestion would be something along the lines of like a 6262 or a 6264 precision turbo. Also, if you go onto the Pulsar website, they also have similar sizing turbos to that of precision. Again, if you want a dealer that sells precision turbos, I recommend you guys shooting Maslow Motorsports a message or heading on over to my boys at boostlab.com and checking out their lineup of precision or even their own turbos. This is a T3 style flange design, so this will bolt up to any T3 manifold on the market. They also offer these, again, like I said, in V-band. There are tons of designs out there. Something I would like to see in the near future on a 300ZX, and it's something that probably most of you have never heard of before, but they're very common in like the GTRs and twin turbo Lambos, and that is the Zona rotor, X-O-N-A rotor. I'm going to use their 6157 as an example, as it is actually a turbo that I would not mind getting. Now the 6157, in the name of a Zona rotor turbo, the first two numbers stand for the flow rate of the turbo. So instead of saying the horsepower rating, they say the flow rate. So it's a 61 pound per minute turbo with a 57 millimeter exducer on the exhaust side. Something totally different. No other turbo manufacturer uses those sizes, but that is what they've chosen, and I don't fully understand it. But if it helps them, it works for them, more power to them. Again, Zona rotor, honestly, something I'd very much like to see on a 300ZX someday, because the turbo frame size is smaller than the Garrett. There is one more manufacturer that I will throw in here, and that is BorgWarner, which you may probably never see or hear of, at least not much on a 300ZX platform, because these turbo housings, their general dimension of the turbos are just too big for these cars. I'm going to use the S257 and the S360 as an example. The first digit in the naming, such as the 2 or the 3, is basically the frame size, much like Garrett's G25 or G30. And then you run into the second two numbers. So like a 57 is a 57 millimeter inducer, and the 60, which is a 60 millimeter inducer. So you have the S257 and the S360. Okay guys, that's pretty much gonna do it for this video. Obviously, I personally love the 5449 G25 660 style turbo. It is honestly a perfect size for so many applications, and they spool up so great. But anyways, y'all, I hope you got something out of this. I really hope you'll be able to take what I've put in this video today and apply it to other turbo brands. If you don't believe me, just go onto other manufacturers' websites, go onto the Garrett website, look up the compressor maps, look up the exhaust housing maps, do your own research. I've spent years accumulating all this information. This is honestly something that I love delving into and I love talking about. But I hope you all got some sort of valuable information out of this. If you did, and you're not subscribed already, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button and smash the like button if you are subscribed. Remember, you can only subscribe once, but you can smash the like button every time. I greatly appreciate every single one of you, and we'll see y'all next time.